In this video, I will be showing how I create this character that you see here. I will be going over the entire process starting from scratch. There is a lot to cover, so I decided to do a voiceover to explain everything afterwards instead of trying to do it all at the same time. I'll also show how to animate it, which is interesting because I've never created a human walk cycle in 3D before. You'll be seeing my first ever attempt at it, so if I can do it, you can do it too. I have made a separate video prior to this one that goes over how to make complex shapes. I made that video in preparation for this one, so it may be useful to watch that first if you haven't already. It covers a lot of useful tips and techniques. So let's begin looking at the process of creating a character. I start by creating a new blank tile set and removing the default one. Then I select a section of the tile set and begin placing tiles into the scene. When modeling a character, it can be difficult to decide how to begin if you've never modeled it before. The process generally begins rough and unstable. It is similar to a sketch or a drawing where the lines appear sketchy and imprecise at first, but as you rework it, it becomes more defined and clear. I use these tiles as a way to block in and generalize the form. I can then build off of it and continue refining it as I go. Even if it's imprecise, having something in place for me to shape helps me visualize the rest. I try to keep everything boxy and square so that I don't overwork everything. I also try to keep the tile count low because it is more manageable for me, and a lot of the smaller details can be expressed in the texture instead. Right now I am focusing on the torso of the character. I shape it a little bit just to get the overall dimensions and to develop a sense of the proportions. I'm not trying to be too precise with these adjustments. I just shift some of the vertices slightly to give the impression of certain characteristics of the torso, like where the rib cage sticks out and how it tapers towards the neck and pelvis. Depending on how the rest of the model is constructed, I may make alterations to the torso to help balance everything out or fix proportions, but it is too soon to know exactly how everything will look. I just have a vague idea that I hold in my mind. Notice that I try to keep certain edges straight and horizontal or vertical, even though some are diagonal. This helps keep the form simple and it appears a bit more orderly too. If every vertex were shifted in some odd way, then it would appear more random or loose and could influence how I continue building from it. It's like choosing to cross a straight and rigid stone bridge with a flat surface, or a wobbly rope suspension bridge with an uneven surface. One is going to make me feel more at ease and be simpler to cross, whereas the other might be more thrilling but require more focus and energy. Which route I take will affect what type of journey I will have. At this point, I have a good sense of how the torso will look, and I feel like moving on to another part. I group these tiles into their own object because I plan to keep it separate from everything else. Now I reposition the 3D crosshair and I begin placing some tiles for the head. I try to use a limited number of tiles. Using a small number will help force me to keep it simple and generalized. I try to visualize the head and how it will be shaped, and I feel like 3 rows of tiles will work okay. I'll be able to taper the top and also the bottom. At this moment, I'm just trying to visualize how I can adjust the vertices so that the shape can be realized. As I make changes to the shape, I will look at it from various angles to get a sense of its dimensions and form relative to the torso. Rotating the camera and seeing everything at different angles helps develop my sense of space and how each detail relates with other details. I look at how they align or don't align, and this helps me get a feeling if something should be positioned elsewhere. A lot of these small changes are experimental. By shifting the vertices one way or another, I can get a sense as to how those changes affect the form. I might revert those changes if they don't feel right. I basically just use my understanding of what a head looks like to determine my decisions. I know that the top of the head is more round than the front, and the jaw area tapers towards the chin, becoming narrower. I try to represent these characteristics using a limited amount of tiles. I intentionally ignore some characteristics like the way the eye socket area usually recedes in and how the bridge of the nose sticks out, and other smaller details. Those characteristics can certainly be expressed with the tiles, but I would probably have to use more tiles and take extra time to figure out how to shape them. For this example, I just want it simple for starters. I currently have the grid rounding value set to 8 pixels, so when I shift the vertices, they will move at 8 pixel increments. If I want, I can set the grid rounding value smaller so that I can have finer control over the positions of the vertices. I continue to edit the tiles as I try to develop a shape that I think will work well. Using a higher grid rounding value as opposed to a lower value helps to reduce the number of ways it can be shaped. This can help alleviate the decision-making process at the expense of accuracy. In some cases, though, it is nice to use a lower grid rounding value to make subtle adjustments and be able to shape things more accurately. With regards to the character's jaw, I set the grid rounding value to 2 and make some adjustments. I think the shape looks okay for now. I can always make adjustments to it later if I need to. I'll fill in the empty space behind the jaw before moving on. I'll select all the tiles and group them into their own object. I'll also make sure to move the 3D crosshair to a position where I want the object's local origin point to be. This is the position the object will pivot around when it is rotated, and will affect how it is animated. With the head now as its own object, I can move it into place and check to see how it looks relative to the torso. I look at it from various angles to get a sense of how the forms flow together. This helps me decide how the head should be positioned. I can see the neck sticks out and intersects the jaw, so I should probably adjust the neck to make it fit better. I'll shift some of the vertices at the top to taper it and see how that looks. Now that the neck is adjusted, I fine-tune the position of the head. I also want to check how it looks when the head rotates. I feel that the local origin point of the head could be positioned slightly further to the back, so I reposition the crosshair where I want it and reassign the origin point. Then I check how it rotates again to see how it looks. I think it rotates better now, but there is an odd gap behind the jaw. I think if I move the front side of the neck forwards, it will fill in that space and everything will look like it connects better. I think it is looking pretty good at this point, so I will move on. The torso seems a bit short compared to the size of the head, so I want to edit the vertices a bit to see if I can improve the proportions. This is why it's not necessary to spend too much time on something initially, because as I develop other parts, the new parts will influence how I see the previous parts. I move on to the next part and begin adding tiles to the scene. These will represent one of the legs. I block in a simple shape like I have done previously, and then I will edit the vertices a bit. I'm going to keep the leg relatively straight, but I want the top part near the hip to taper a bit. The leg is going to be its own separate object and will intersect the pelvis, so the tapered end will help it appear round and will be less likely to poke out when the leg is rotated during an animation. I lengthen some of the tiles and keep the majority of the vertices near the knee. Those vertices can be used later to express how the leg bends when I attach bones to them. I continue to rotate the camera after making adjustments so that I can see what else needs to be worked on. I can see here that the leg looks too thin from the side, so I expand it a bit. It looks okay for now, so I decide to move on to the knee area. There are many ways you can model the joints of a character, and I haven't modeled that many, so I still have a lot to learn. I want to design the tile so that there is a center position that acts like a hinge, and other tiles will expand or contract around it when they are animated. I also want to continue to keep the leg boxy and straight so that I don't get lost in more subtle details and overcomplicate everything. I add a tile behind the knee because I feel like it needs a piece that will collapse when the leg bends. This will help prevent other tiles from becoming deformed. I then adjust some vertices on the sides, positioning them to the center where I want the lower leg to pivot from. I adjust the vertices on the back side to make it slightly indented, just to emphasize how the knee becomes narrow there. Since this character will wear pants, I still keep it somewhat boxy and with a consistent thickness. If I were to shape it more, it might begin to look more muscly rather than something baggy and undefined. I'll have to add some extra tiles to fill in the gaps. Each tile consists of two triangles, but I can just hide one of them by collapsing it. If the verts are merged when exporting, the collapsed tiles will be removed. Okay, I think that looks pretty good and simple for the structure of the leg. I look at it a bit and feel like I can shape some parts of it to emphasize certain characteristics of the leg. I move some of the verts on the back side of the lower leg to focus where the calves stick out, and I also move some near the bottom to express how the leg tapers and becomes smaller towards the ankle. I look at it some more to gauge how those changes look, and I also try to sense what else could be improved or experimented with. In this case, I think that maybe the upper leg could be slightly thicker and closer to the thickness of the pelvis, so I edit the vertices at the top slightly. I also feel like maybe the knee is slightly too low, so I raise it a bit. I keep looking at it as I try to measure the proportions of everything with my eyes and develop an understanding of how everything is constructed. I'm trying to decide if anything looks unusual or needs alteration. I decide to make the leg slightly thicker and reposition the vertices at the center of the knee. I might edit things again later, but for now I'll group the tiles into their own object. I try to decide where I want the leg to pivot from, and then I move the 3D crosshair to that position before grouping the tiles into an object. This way the local origin point of the object will be set where I want it to be. Next, I move the leg where I think it should connect with the pelvis. I immediately notice that the pelvis is too small, so I look at it a bit and try to decide how I want to edit it. I will have to expand it a bit so that the form matches better with the top of the leg. I look at it from various angles as I try to understand the proportions of the leg and how those relate with the proportions of the torso. I want the proportions to look somewhat natural. I continue to shift some vertices around, experimenting with the shape to see what effects it will have on the proportions. I feel like the stomach area juts in abruptly and only consists of a few vertices, so I am wondering how it will look if I add an extra row of tiles there. I separate the vertices so as to create a gap for the new tiles. I could have split the existing tiles in half to create more vertices, but I decided to just add the new tiles manually. Here I am just copy and pasting the tile and rotating it so that I can have one facing each side. I enjoy the process of shifting around the vertices on the grid and seeing them snap into place. The low poly nature allows each vertex to stand out and capture my attention. I like the simplistic nature of that. Now that the extra tiles are added, I look at it from various angles and try to get a sense of how each detail relates with every other detail. I feel like the vertices can be reworked a bit, so I begin to shift around them and experiment with the form of the torso. I want to find a form that balances well with the head and the legs. I'll speed up this part because it involves just a lot of experimenting with the vertices, and I ultimately undo a lot of it because those changes didn't improve anything. A lot of times I will have to try making a change first in order to see how it looks, and that will give me a better understanding as to which way works the best. Sometimes the new ways work better and sometimes the previous ways work better. I decide to add another leg. This will allow me to visualize more of the character and get a better sense of the proportions and how they balance with each other. I basically just keep reworking it until I feel like it looks good enough. I try not to overwork it though, so I continue to try and keep the shapes relatively boxy and simplistic. At this point, I want to see how the legs look when it is rotated up and if the overlapping parts look okay when they are posed differently. I'm also looking at where the knee will reach when it is rotated towards the torso. I want it to look somewhat natural, so I think it should reach close to the shoulder. I experiment more with some of the vertices. I think that perhaps the local origin point of the leg could be repositioned slightly downwards so that the top part of the leg pivots out more when the leg rotates. I think this should make the silhouette appear less bumpy when it is posed. After repositioning the local origin point of the object, I try rotating it various ways to get a sense of how the shapes overlap and flow together in various situations. I think it looks alright for now, so I will move on. I want to work on the arms next. They will be very similar to the legs, so instead of creating them from scratch tile by tile, I will just clone the leg and rework the tiles into a form that suits an arm. I'll add the new arm object to the scene, but first I will reposition the crosshair where I want the object to be placed. It is immediately clear that the arm is too large, and that shouldn't be a surprise since it was copied from the leg. I will have to rework the tiles by adjusting the vertices so that the arm becomes smaller and more proportional. To check the proportions, I can simply reference my own arm. I know that my elbow reaches somewhere around my waist, and my wrist reaches somewhere midway on my upper leg. I shift the vertices to match these measurements to the best of my judgment. It may not be entirely accurate, but I continue to look at the tiles from various angles to check how they balance with the rest of the body. The knee of the leg faces forward, but the elbow should face backwards, so I will rotate the arm 180 degrees so that it faces the correct way. I am rotating the tiles inside the object and not the object itself. This way I keep the orientation of the arm correct. The arm looks a bit too thick, so I shift some of the vertices to make it thinner. At this point, I take some time to try and visually measure the proportions and decide what could be improved. I look at it from various angles to help me get a good grasp on how all the forms relate. I make some more adjustments to the vertices until I get satisfied with how it looks. To help me visualize the proportions, I move the arm back into place so that the shoulder connects to the body. Then I rotate it various ways to see how this connection looks. The arm looks a bit disconnected when it is rotated, so I make adjustments to the position of the arm and then test various orientations again to see if it looks any better. I continue doing this until I have found a good placement for the arm. I think this placement will work fine. I still want to edit the arm, but it would be easier to edit it if it weren't rotated. I can place another instance of the arm that isn't rotated and edit that instead. I feel like the elbow area has the vertices spread out too much. I adjust the vertices a bit so that the elbow joint takes up less space. I also shortened the arm slightly because it looks too long. I haven't added the hand yet, and I know that the fingers usually can reach right above where the knee begins, so by shortening the arm I will make more space for the hand. I begin to add tiles for the hand. I keep it boxy to begin with. I don't want to make it too complicated. There won't be any individual fingers, for example. It will just be a generalized shape. I think that looks pretty good considering how simple it is. I want to add the feet to the legs in order to get a better sense of their length in relation to the arms, so I'll work on adding those next. Again, I keep the shape simple and try not to overcomplicate it. Keeping the tiles straight and aligned provides a feeling that the form has an intentional form to it, whereas if I were to introduce more angles and variations to the form, it might introduce more randomness and ambiguity to how you perceive the forms or how you build off of it. It's up to you how you want to approach it though. Now that the feet are added, I get a feeling that the torso is too short, so I try repositioning the legs and make some adjustments to the vertices belonging to the torso. I also rotate the legs and mess around with their vertices a bit to help me visualize how their measurements compare with the rest of the body. I am trying to visualize the balance between all the different forms and develop a grasp on their proportions. If anything looks odd, I will make adjustments to see if I can make those details appear less odd. I continue making adjustments, fine-tuning some of the smaller details. I make the hand slightly smaller and also taper the forearm slightly. At this point, most of the larger forms are pretty much settled in my mind. I also fill in any missing tiles so that everything looks more complete. Something about the head doesn't look quite right to me, so I spend some time adjusting the vertices and trying different things to see if there is any other shapes that look better or that are more balanced with the rest of the body. It is a bit difficult to describe this process because a lot of it is just experimentation. The changes may produce unexpected results, which require me to re-evaluate the new forms and judge whether it looks better or worse. I keep the good results and discard the bad results based on my intuition. Now that I have everything pretty much settled, I decide to clone the arm so that I can have a mirrored copy on the other side of the character. I rename the arm objects to distinguish the left arm from the right arm. Next, I find the location of the left arm. Since the character is centered across the x-axis, I can just invert this value and set the crosshair to this position. Then I add the right arm to the scene at the location of the crosshair. I'll also need to edit the right arm and mirror the tiles. All I have to do is edit the object, select the tiles, and press the R key. The tiles will be mirrored relative to the crosshair position and the camera direction. Now that the arm looks correct, I can stop editing the object and then rotate it to match the angle of the other arm. I can remove the extra arm since that is not needed anymore. At this point, I try rotating the character's limbs various ways to see how everything looks. Now that the geometry of the character is pretty much set, I'll begin editing the UVs. The UV coordinates specify what portion of the texture is displayed on the tiles. When I select the tile faces in the 3D scene, their UVs will appear in the UV panel where I can edit them. I'll select them and press U to unwrap them. This operation will essentially flatten the UVs so that they match the shape of the tiles. This operation will also attempt to connect them together edge to edge. If I double-click on one of the UV parts, it will select the entire group of connecting UVs, and I can move them easily and reposition them where I would like. I will need to figure out how I want to organize all of the UVs so that they all fit on the texture. I continue to unwrap the UVs, but I also take time to try and figure out which tiles I want to unwrap together and connect. I try to look for groups of tiles that face the same way or are oriented similarly to each other. I also think about how their UVs will be represented on the texture so that it will make it easier to paint later. Here I decide to organize the group of UVs more closely together so that their coordinates touch each other. By dragging a group by one of the coordinates, I can hold Shift to snap it to another coordinate that I hover over. If I don't need to unwrap multiple UVs, I can choose to flatten UVs by pressing N. For example, with the tile underneath the jaw, I can flatten its UVs and manually position it. By clicking and dragging it near its edge, I can hold Shift to snap it to the edge of another UV section that I hover over. This way I can build out the map of UVs and decide precisely how I want it. If I hover over the UV coordinate, the corresponding vertex in the 3D scene will become highlighted, allowing me to grasp the orientation of the UVs. This way I will know which edge needs to be connected together without requiring any visual cues from the texture. This is useful in cases when there are no visual details on the texture that can be referenced. I continue to unwrap groups of tiles, organizing them in what I think is a suitable design. These UVs currently take up a large section of the tile set, so I decide to scale them down. I select all the coordinates and then specify a smaller value in the scale inputs and apply it. After seeing the change, I decide that it might be too small. The smaller the UVs are, the less number of pixels will fit within them, so the pixels will appear larger on the 3D model. I don't want the pixels to appear too large on the model, so I decide to use a larger scale for the UVs. I undo the changes and try a value of 0.5 instead. I reposition the UVs to the corner of the tile set and decide to round the coordinates to the nearest pixel. I do this because unwrapping or flattening the UVs resulted in UV coordinates that don't align with the pixels. Scaling the UVs also may have caused them to become unaligned as well. I want them aligned to the pixel so that they are easier to manage and organize, even if the shape of the UVs don't entirely match the shape of the 3D tiles. I begin to select specific coordinates and move them so that they connect with other coordinates. I want to make their UVs seamless so that the pixel details transition across them smoothly without any disconnect. This will make it easier to paint the details of the face later. The pixels might appear slightly stretched due to the UV shape being deformed a bit, but I don't think it will be that noticeable. I use the arrow keys to move the coordinates. By default, they will move by the amount specified in the UV precision input box, but I can hold Control to move them one pixel at a time. I decide at this point to fill in the area that the UVs cover with a different color. I also trace the UVs with the color to ensure that the edges are completely painted. I could begin to add details to the texture using the tools in the painting panel, but I decide to move on to the torso and unwrap those tiles next. The process is the same as before. I select the tiles that I want to unwrap and press the U key. I basically choose the tiles that are facing a similar way and that I think can be connected in a simple way. Once I have them unwrapped and positioned relative to each other, I scale them down by the same amount as before. Keeping the scale consistent will ensure that the pixels maintain the same size across the entire model, which will make everything look more cohesive. I try to optimize my use of the space by moving this group of UVs close to the other group. However, it might be tricky to do depending on the shape of the UV groups. It seems as though I will need to resize the tile set in order to fit the other UV groups belonging to the arms and legs, so I decide I won't be too concerned about it in this example. As demonstrated before, I double-click to select the group of UVs, and then I drag one of the coordinates to connect it to another while holding Shift and hovering over it. This will ensure that they are aligned more precisely. Then I select all the coordinates and align them to the nearest pixel. After that, I look more closely to see if anything else needs to be aligned differently and make some minor adjustments. I notice that the UVs overlap in one location, so I decide to reposition some of them so that they don't overlap. A lot of the UVs don't connect edge to edge, like where the sides of the torso meet the front and back, but that is fine. Finally, I fill the area in with a solid color as well as trace the edges so that it is ready for more details to be painted. I move on to the legs and repeat the process. I basically go through all the steps as before, unwrapping and organizing the UV coordinates. There is not much to be said here that hasn't already been said. It is just a different shape, so I have to determine the best way to group things together and position them relative to each other as I work with it. When I scale down the UVs, they still extend beyond the bounds of the tile set, so instead of trying to fit them into the current dimensions, I choose to expand the size of the tile set. I go to the tile set panel and open the tile set menu there and select Resize Tile Set. Here I resize the canvas width so that it is twice as big, and I make sure it fills in the new space with the specific color that I want. By default, it uses the color chosen in the paint panel. Now that there is more space, I continue positioning the UVs and making adjustments where I think it is necessary so that the coordinates are aligned well. In this case, the UVs belonging to the foot aren't connected as closely as the rest of the leg, so I decide to rearrange those so that they can fit together more seamlessly. If you can get the UVs connected together seamlessly, it is usually good because it allows the pixel details to flow through the tiles more precisely, and it helps to make the process easier when you are painting them. Once I get everything ordered how I like it, I finish the process by filling it in with a base color and tracing the edges, just as I did with the previous areas. As I look at the UV coordinates some more, I see some that can be adjusted further. The gaps between the UVs are very small, and some coordinates could probably be connected so these gaps are reduced or removed completely, allowing the UVs to become straight and uniform too. Currently, the slight angles to some of the UV edges would result with pixels that extend across them unevenly. If I straighten the UVs out, the pixel details will flow along the edges of the tiles more uniformly, so I make some adjustments to the coordinates in order to remove some of the gaps. It's not absolutely necessary, but since the gaps are rather small, I feel like trying it out since it might simplify the painting process, having those areas connected and uniform. I think that is good for now. I can always improve it later or make further adjustments if I feel it is necessary. The arms are the last section that needs to be unwrapped, and I do the exact same process as before, selecting the groups of tiles that I think will connect best, unwrapping them, and organizing everything in the UV panel. I run into an issue where the UVs aren't being unwrapped correctly. I have a suspicion that perhaps the vertices of the tiles aren't exactly aligned. I decide to round the vertices to the nearest pixel in the 3D scene, but I don't want to do it while the arm is rotated. Instead, I'll add another instance that isn't rotated and edit that. This way I know that it will round the vertices correctly and make sure all the vertices connect precisely. It seems to have improved it, but I still run into an issue with one of the tiles. I decide to manually fix it. This issue might be fixed in the latest version of Crocotile, depending on when you view this. I continue to unwrap the rest of the tiles and organize all the coordinates. After rounding the coordinates to the nearest pixel, I begin to fine-tune the positions in order to remove the gaps between the UVs and make them seamless. This will make it easier to paint later, as the pixels will transition across the seams more precisely without any disconnect. When I am satisfied with the placement of everything, I fill in the areas with a solid color. I notice that the right arm still isn't unwrapped since it was cloned earlier. The tiles belonging to that arm have completely different UVs. Instead of unwrapping those, I can just copy the tiles from the left arm and paste them into the right arm, replacing the existing tiles with the new tiles that have been unwrapped. I make sure to position the 3D crosshair at the local origin point of the left arm if it isn't already, and then I select all the tiles and copy them with Ctrl-C. The tiles are copied relative to the crosshair, and in this case the local origin point of the arm. I add an instance of the right arm into the scene so that I have a version that isn't rotated. Then I edit that instance, select all the tiles, and remove them. Afterwards, I paste the tiles that I have copied by pressing Ctrl-V, and then press R to mirror them relative to the crosshair position and camera direction. You can see now that the right arm now matches the left arm and has the same UV coordinates. If I wanted to, I could move the UVs to another section of the tile set. This would allow me to texture the right arm differently from the left arm, but in this case I will just overlap the right arm UVs with the left arm UVs so that they both are textured the same. I'll remove the extra instances now since I don't think they are needed. Next I'll shift over and begin painting the texture, but first I will select the torso tiles because I want to display their UVs in the painting panel. There is a button towards the top right corner of the painting panel that toggles the UVs on or off. Being able to see where the UVs are while you paint can be very helpful. At this stage, I just begin editing the pixels, painting details that I want to add to the character. I use the UVs as a general guide as to where to draw, and I check how the changes look in the 3D scene. I decide to work a bit on the face of the character. In this case, using the vertical symmetry mode would be useful so that I can draw both sides of the face at the same time. This will allow me to draw the face more easily. As I paint the details, I can check how those details look on the model in the 3D scene. This allows me to get an understanding of how my changes affect the overall look. I can continue to make adjustments, developing the details further until I am satisfied with how it looks. I continue editing the pixels of the texture, adding various details that help to illustrate the character. In this case, I am imagining the character as a farmer, wearing some denim overalls. So I plot out the general shapes for the suspenders and keep refining the details the best I can. If there is interest, I could perhaps make some videos focused on the process of painting and editing pixels that is focused more on art-related subjects and visualization, but for this video it would probably cause me to go on many tangents, so for this part we'll just speed it up. Up to this point, both legs are instances of the same object. If I plan to animate the character, it would be good to make them unique from each other like I did with the arms. Each object type can have bones attached, but it is limited to just one instance, so I'll need each leg as their own objects. I'll do the same as I did with the arms. I'll clone the leg and rename them appropriately. Afterwards, I'll make sure the 3D crosshair is positioned where the new leg should go and remove the previous leg. Then I'll add the new leg back in and edit the tiles, mirroring them across the crosshair position relative to the camera direction. I decide to make the head, arms, and legs children of the torso object. I do this by dragging the corresponding items listed in the instance list into the torso instance so that they become nested within it. Now if I move the torso, the other instances will move with it. I reposition everything so that the character stands on the scene's origin point. The origin point is the position where x, y, and z is equal to 0. I do this so that there is a simple reference point while animating the character. If I treat the origin point as the floor, I'll be able to determine how to pose the character relative to that. To make it simpler to add the bones to the character, I'll rotate the arms so that they align with the X, Y, and Z axes. I'll have to enable the skinned mesh for the objects that I want to add bones to, so I double-click on the object listed in the Scene panel to open its object properties where I can enable the skin. I'll start with the arms first. Once the skin is enabled, it will display a skeleton item in the instance list belonging to the objects. I'll be able to place bones into these so that they become part of the skeleton. At the top of the Scene panel, I click a button to add a bone to the scene. The bone is placed where my 3D crosshair is located, which is currently set to the position of the arm. I drag the bone listed in the instance list into the skeleton attached to the left arm. If I rotate the bone now, I will be posing the bone. However, if I enter Object Edit mode by editing the arm, it will reset the bone to its unposed state. I'll undo that and return to editing the arm. I'll need to orient the bones in this state first, and then assign vertex weights so that the mesh can bend correctly. In the Transform panel, I can set the bone's length and thickness so that it fits the model more accurately. There is also a checkbox to show the skin's vertex weights, which is why the tiles look gray currently. They are gray because no weights have been set yet. I set the length of the bone so that the tip of it reaches where the elbow joint is located. I also increased the thickness of the bone so that it will be easier to click and select. At this point, I look at it a bit from various angles to see if I have it positioned where I would like it. I want the tip of the bone to be close to the center of the elbow joint, so I move it slightly. Next, I move the crosshair to the tip of the bone, and I look at how it aligns with the vertices that construct the elbow joint. I feel as though it is slightly off from where the vertices converge. I want the crosshair positioned where they converge so that when I place a bone relative to that position and then rotate it, the vertices will rotate around that point evenly. I move the crosshair to the vertices and then readjust it so that it is located within the arm. This way, when I add the next bone, it will be positioned where I want it. I add another bone and adjust its orientation, length, and thickness so that it fits within the forearm. Then I move the crosshair to the tail end of the bone and add another one. I adjust it as well to fit the hand. I forget to add the bones to the skeleton, but I'll end up doing that soon. When I exit Object Edit mode, the bones will return to their posed state. In this case, the bone attached to the skeleton becomes rotated. I can reset it to its default pose by selecting the bone, right-clicking on it, and choosing Restore Pose or Restore Pose All. The second option will restore all the nested bones as well. I decide to move on to the right arm and add bones to it in the exact same way as the left arm. I also notice that I forgot to add the previous bones to the skeleton, so I do that first. I made sure to position my crosshair to the position of the right arm so that when I add the bone, it will be positioned where I want it. I also make sure to add it to the skeleton. From here, I follow the same steps as before. I continue to add the bones until it matches the other arm. The third bone should be nested within the second bone, and the second bone should be nested within the first bone. This way, when one is rotated, any nested bones will rotate with it. I exit Object Edit mode again and restore the poses to their default state. I also notice that I forgot to add the last bone to the skeleton. I decide to rename the bones so that they will be easier to distinguish from each other. Now that the arms have their bones, I move on to the other objects, beginning with the torso. I follow the same steps. I enable the skin in the Object's Properties panel. I edit the object. I move the crosshair where I'd like to place the bone. I add it to the scene, add it to the skeleton, orient it, and adjust the length and thickness. I repeat this process for all the bones that I need. I use 3 bones for each object. Depending on what you are modeling or animating, you may need to use more, but since my character is simple, I only need a few. Sometimes it might not even be necessary to use bones. This character's head won't use any bones, for example. I'll just animate the instance on its own instead. I'll end up nesting the head inside the neck bone so that it rotates and moves with the neck and torso. When I have the bones for the torso settled, I exit Object Edit mode and restore the pose to the default state. Then I'll move on to the next object. At this point, all the bones have been added to the character. However, none of them have been assigned to any vertices, so posing the bones will do nothing at the moment. I'll need to begin specifying which bones influence what vertices and by how much. I'll begin with the torso. I first enter Object Edit mode. I then select the vertices that I want to attach to the pelvis bone. In the skin section, I select the pelvis bone in list 0 and assign a weight of 1 to the selected vertices. This will cause any changes to the bone to have 100% influence on the vertices. If you have the checkbox in the skin section enabled, you'll see the gray color change to orange, indicating the amount of weight those vertices have. I select this next group of vertices that are positioned between the first bone and the second bone. I want these vertices weighed equally by both bones. I make a mistake of choosing the same bone in list 1, but I set the correct weight of 0.5. The reason why it changes to orange is because so far only one bone influences these vertices. If I select the chest bone in list 1 instead and reassign the weight, it returns to gray because it only displays the weight of the currently selected bone. Then if I set the weight for the index 0 to 0.5 and assign it to the pelvis bone, it changes to a yellow color indicating that these vertices are being influenced by the pelvis bone by 50%. Selecting another bone will cause the skin to show different colors and help you visualize which vertices are weighed to the bone and by how much. I select another group of vertices that I want to assign the weights to. Unfortunately, I assigned the weight to the wrong bone again, but I suppose this will serve as an example on common mistakes you might make. Instead of assigning the weight to the chest bone, I assign it to the pelvis bone, but I can easily reassign it. Each vertex can be assigned up to 4 bones that can influence it. The 4 lists in the skin section of the transform panel correspond to an index in the vertices. By selecting from one of these lists, you can assign a specific bone and weight to that particular index in the vertex. For this next group of vertices, I assign a weight of 0.5 to both the chest bone and the neck bone. This process of assigning weights to vertices may seem strange at first, but it is pretty simple once you get the hang of it. I finished the torso by assigning weights to the remaining vertices. Now that the weights have been set, I can exit Object Edit mode. If I want to test how the torso bends and morphs, I can try rotating some of the bones, posing them in different ways. I notice that the head doesn't move with the neck, and that is because I haven't nested the head inside the neck bone yet. With the head now set as a child of the neck bone, it will rotate and move with the rest of the body. Next, I will assign weights to the arms. I will need both arms to bend and morph the same way, so I will need to take note on how I decide to distribute the weights across the vertices so that I can do it similarly on both arms. Firstly, I try to decide which vertices will be influenced 100% by the upper arm bone. If other bones will influence the vertices, I deselect those for now. The vertices behind the elbow, for example, will probably be weighed to both the upper arm bone and lower arm bone. I select the upper arm bone for index 0 and assign a weight of 1 for these selected vertices. I try to determine the best way to distribute the weight across the vertices behind the elbow. I decide to progressively decrease and increase the weight the upper arm bone and lower arm bone have on the vertices behind the elbow joint. As you watch, it should become clear how these weights are distributed. Just so you know, the weights are normalized in the program, so even if you set a weight lower than 1, the color will appear orange until the weight is spread across another bone. I continue the process, selecting the lower arm bone so that I can visualize which vertices have been weighed to it. This way I know which vertices need to be weighed. I can use the list above the 4 other lists to quickly select a specific bone in the skeleton. Now that all the vertices have their weights set, I can test out the bones, posing them in different ways to see how the mesh bends and morphs. I can always make changes to the weights, but I think it'll look fine for this example. I don't have much experience modeling characters and the way their joints are constructed or skinned, so there are probably many different ways you could build it. I'm interested in seeing what other people can make. Now that the left arm is complete, I move on to the other arm and repeat the entire process. The legs are constructed very similar to the arms, so the process is the same as well. A benefit of keeping things simple like this is that it makes skinning a lot easier. If there are fewer tiles and vertices, there are less weights to assign, and by developing a pattern to the shapes, it can be easy to organize how the weights are distributed. If there were a lot more vertices and complexity to the model, it would become a more involved process. For beginners, it is best to start simple so that you can develop confidence working with all the different features and components. As you become more familiar with how it all works, you'll become more capable of doing more. At this point, the skinning process is complete. I test out various poses to see how everything works together. I find that the arms are detached from the torso. I realize that they should be attached to the chest bone so that they move along with it. To fix this, I drag the arms listed in the instance list to the chest bone so that they become nested within it. I try posing it again just to make sure it works how I expect it to. I can disable wireframe mode and also hide the bones so that I can see how the character looks without those elements in the way. Now that everything is ready, we can start the process of animating the character. To access the animation features, I'll go to the Edit menu and then go to Window and then choose Animation to open the Animation panel. When I click on objects in the scene or other entities such as bones, they will become listed in the animation panel. I will first create an idle action for each object and bone. This will serve as a kind of default action. To do this, I select Add New Action from the corresponding action menu listed in the animation panel. I also rename these actions as well. When exporting, it will combine all the actions with the same name together into one animation so that all the objects and bones get played together. If this is confusing, it should make more sense later. I continue to add the actions and rename them to idle. However, since recording this video, I have updated Crocotile with the ability to simplify this process and create actions for all the objects or entities that are currently selected all in one step. You will be able to find a similar menu above the timeline now that will allow you to add actions to all the listed entities. Once all the idle actions have been added to the entities, I decide to add a single keyframe at the beginning of each of them. I choose the position, rotation, and scale attributes to set, and click the Add Keyframe button to add the keyframe. The keyframes for each attribute will be shown listed in the timeline next to each entity or object in the list. I add the keyframes for all the listed objects and bones. Perhaps I need to add a way to add keyframes to multiple objects at the same time. Depending on when you watch this video, there might be improvements made to the animation features. Now I have an idle action set on every object and bone, along with a keyframe. Next I'll add a walk action to each object and bone. I repeat the process, adding an action and renaming it for each object and bone, but it will be simpler to select the options above the timeline that is available in the new version of Crocotile, so that you can add the action to everything all in one step. Now that the action has been added to each object and bone, I want to make sure I only add rotation keyframes because that attribute is all I need to modify to animate a walking animation. I could add some position keyframes later, but for now I want to focus on rotation keyframes, so make sure to choose rotation in the attribute drop-down list for each object and bone. Once all of that is set, I am ready to begin adding keyframes and animating the walk cycle. Since this will be a walk animation, I'll start with one of the legs. I'll select the object or bone that I want to animate and make sure the walk action is selected. In this case, the upper leg bone doesn't need to rotate because I can simply rotate the entire leg instance instead. Afterwards, I will shift my focus on the lower leg and foot once I have some overall motion defined. I think it makes sense to first focus on the parts further up the hierarchy because the nested parts further down the hierarchy will be dependent on how those are rotated. For example, the foot bone will be dependent on the lower leg bone, and the lower leg bone will be dependent on the upper leg and the leg instance. Getting those upper parts defined well first will make it easier to define the lower parts. I begin to rotate the leg, but in this case I feel like it will be useful to enable the auto keyframe mode so that keyframes are added automatically to the action whenever changes are made to the object. There is a button above the timeline to toggle it on or off. I'll also need to be in paused mode. By default, the auto keyframe mode will only record changes while the timeline is paused. Now when I rotate the leg, you can see the keyframe become automatically added to the action at the current position of the blue playhead. Any further changes at the same position in the timeline will overwrite the existing keyframe. I can change the position of the playhead by clicking and dragging it. This will allow me to set keyframes at specific times in the action. While recording this video, I noticed that in some cases the objects don't get refreshed to their correct orientation. This issue should be fixed in the latest version of Crocotile. You can see that I am positioning the playhead at various times in the timeline and rotating the leg to where I think it should be at that point in time. I begin the action with the leg forward, and I progressively rotate it backwards until I think it should stop. When I play the action, I can see how everything interpolates between keyframes to create the motion of the leg. You might notice the crosshair and gizmo reorienting to the orientation of the leg. This is because I have the gizmo alignment option set to object mode. There is a button at the top of the 3D scene to toggle it. This mode can be useful while animating, as it allows you to make rotations relative to the selected object or bone. Now that the leg has some overall movement, I deselect it and select the lower leg bone next. I decide to turn off auto keyframe mode so that I can show you how to manually place some keyframes. During the motion of the leg instance, I basically keep the lower leg bone straight and without any rotation. However, once the leg instance has traveled backward all the way, I add another keyframe for the lower leg bone, rotating it further to make the leg bend. This will cause the foot to swing back as if the character is stepping and pushing with that foot. I play the action a few times as I try to visualize the motion and how everything will look. I can always make adjustments to the keyframes if I need to or if I want to experiment with the motions. In this case, I test how it will look if I make the lower leg bend further. I replace the keyframe with a new one and play the action again to see the changes. It seems like the foot travels too far back, so I decide to undo those changes. I tried to decide how to continue. This is my first time animating a walk cycle, so I try to determine what parts need to rotate and at what time. I try to visualize myself walking and where the knees and feet are positioned at every moment and how those positions change. I deselect the lower leg bone and I switch back to the leg instance. I decide to continue adding motion to this object, which the lower leg and foot are reliant on. I add another keyframe with the same rotation so that the leg pauses a bit when it comes back all the way. Then I add more keyframes as the leg travels forward. I play the action to see how it looks and try to see if anything looks odd or needs to be changed. I feel like maybe the lower leg should bend more as it travels forward so that it doesn't drag across the ground. I add another keyframe with the same rotation so that it maintains that orientation for a short moment without changing. Then I add another keyframe to extend the lower leg out further so that the foot can come forward more. You might notice the orientation of the bones refreshing incorrectly when a keyframe is added. This is an issue that has been fixed in the latest version of Crocotile. I play the action some more to see how these new keyframes interpolate with the rest of the keyframes. I think it is looking pretty good so far. As I look at all the movements, I try to figure out if anything needs to be improved. Some movements seem a bit slow in certain places, or the leg isn't bending at a suitable time. I try moving some of the keyframes around to see if I can improve the flow and make the movement look more natural. This involves a lot of experimentation, testing different timings, and repeatedly playing the action as I try to visualize everything. There is a loop button at the top of the animation panel that I can enable so that the actions are played repeatedly. I think this looks good, but I'll need to add a keyframe at the end that matches the keyframe at the beginning so that it interpolates back to the beginning correctly. At the moment, it just snaps back to the starting pose since the last keyframe is different from the first. Now the action cycles more smoothly. I move on to the foot bone next and add keyframes to it as well. Since the motion for the larger parts of the leg have been put into place, it makes it simple to see how the foot needs to be angled throughout the duration of the walk cycle. I changed the rotate interval amount to a smaller value so that I can rotate the foot at smaller increments. The changes in the foot are subtle compared to the other parts of the leg. Here I want to make it look like the foot is pushing down against the ground continuously as the foot moves backward. As the foot moves forward, I'll need to make the foot angle up so that there is some space between it and the ground. I add some more keyframes to complete the motion and play the action a bit to see how it looks. I think it looks good, so I decide to move on. I'll animate the other leg next, but instead of adding all the keyframes again, I can just copy the keyframes from this leg and paste them to the other leg. I select all the keyframes that I want to copy, and then select the Copy Keyframes option from within the keyframe menu. Then I open the menu belonging to the other object and choose Paste Keyframes. I will have to reorder the keyframes so that when one leg travels forward, the other leg travels backward. I determine what the duration is for this action. It looks like it is about 2.5 seconds long, so I know that the middle is around 1.25 seconds. The keyframe in the middle will have to end up at the beginning and the end, since this leg will essentially have its keyframes shifted halfway so that it moves opposite the other leg. I move the keyframes accordingly and copy and paste the keyframe that was previously in the middle so that it is now at the beginning and the end. Now when I play the action, the leg swings opposite of the other leg. I repeat these steps, copying the keyframes for the foot bone and the lower leg bone and pasting them into the other bones, shifting the keyframes as well so that they move opposite of each other. You can see how this becomes a fairly simple process once you have one side complete. I play the action and take a moment to appreciate what I have accomplished. Even though I still have to animate the other parts such as the arms, the main movements of the walk cycle is present, and I think it looks good. Next, I work on the arm. I begin by adding keyframes to the left arm instance. I use the existing motion of the legs to help determine where the arm should be during the action. Since the leg begins extended forward, I'll begin the arm extended behind the character. As the leg moves back, the arm will move forward. I decide how far forward and back the arm should swing and add those keyframes. I make sure the first and last keyframes are the same so that it loops seamlessly. Since the keyframes are simple for this part, I add the keyframes manually to the other arm. I might not have been able to copy and paste the keyframes anyway since the arms are angled differently. Next, I add keyframes to the lower arm bone. The movement will be subtle so that it bends only slightly. I try to copy and paste the keyframes to the other lower arm bone, but I run into a problem. You may recall that originally when I was adding bones to the arms, the arm instances were rotated outwards on either side of the body. This resulted with me rotating the bones in different ways when I added them to the arms. If I copy and paste the keyframes, the data doesn't realize this difference and just assumes they are oriented the same way. However, since they are not, the results look incorrect. You can see here that the arm bends backwards instead of forwards, probably because I had rotated the left arm bones to the left to fit within the arm that was pointing to the left at the time, and I rotated the other bones to the right to fit the arm that was pointing to the right. I didn't realize what issues this would cause at the time, so it is something to consider while adding bones to your models. Instead of copy and pasting the keyframes, I'll just have to manually add them, but it will be simple since there aren't that many keyframes to add. I'll use the other arm as a reference so that I can match the motion. Now that the arm movements are done, I will add some movement to the body so that the shoulders turn slightly as it walks. I select the chest bone and decide where I'll place the keyframes. When one arm is extended forwards, the body should probably be turned one way, and when the other arm is extended forwards, it should be turned the opposite way. So those would occur at the beginning, middle, and end of the action. I want to add keyframes when the body is facing forwards though, so these keyframes should be halfway between the moments when the body is turned. Now that those keyframes are added, I simply rotate the bone and add the other keyframes to complete the movement. Since I don't want the head to face the same direction as the torso while it rotates, I'll add some keyframes to it so that it rotates opposite to the torso. This way the character will continue looking straight ahead. As I play the action, I feel like I can make it look more natural if the character moves up and down slightly. These little details can help to round out the animation and make it feel complete. It also adds a bit more dynamic movement to everything and makes it appear more fluid. I select the torso object and make sure to change the attribute that I want to key. In this case, I choose the position property since I will be moving the torso instead of rotating it. I also change the grid rounding value so that I can make more precise adjustments to the object. I add the keyframes and rework them until I have a movement that looks good. In this case, the character will look as if it is pushing with its foot and landing on the opposite foot. I look at the action some more and find one other thing that bothers me. It feels like the feet kick out too far, so I make some adjustments to the legs so that they don't swing forward as much. After making those adjustments, I take a look at everything again. I think it looks good. There are some things I can probably improve, but I think this serves as a good example. I should mention one issue that I ran into in case you run into it too. I found that part of my model became repositioned in a strange way. I believe this occurred because I may have repositioned the origin point of the torso object after the bones were added. If I move the crosshair to the position of the instance, you will see that the pelvis bone isn't located at the same position. To fix this, I will edit the torso object so that I can then reposition the bone's default unposed state. I will reposition the bone to the crosshair where I originally intended it to be. Then I will stop editing the torso object and move the bone to the crosshair again. I probably could have chose to restore the pose from the context menu to get the same result. I also reset the key that I originally added to the idle action, because that position key holds the previously incorrect position. Now the problem should be fixed, so if you run into a similar issue, hopefully this will help. The most likely reason is due to changing the origin point of the object after setting up your bones or keyframes. Generally speaking, you'll want to leave the animation stuff until you have all the modeling stuff straightened out, but you can still modify things later if you know what you are doing. Now I will export the character to demonstrate that everything works. After saving my work, I go to File and then Export Scene. This will open the Export panel. Make sure the file format is set to GLTF or GLB. These are the only formats that Crocotile can export animations to. You can also take a look at all my other settings here, but if you need more information about each one, you can find it detailed in the documentation on the Crocotile website. Now that it is exported, I will just open it in the default 3D viewer that Windows provides, but you can use whatever program you like. You can even import it into a game engine if you are developing a game or something like that. As you can see, the model has both the idle and walk animations, and I can choose which one to play. The entire process took about 4.5 hours, beginning with modeling the character, texturing it, adding the bones and vertex weights, and then keyframing the animations. Considering it was my first time I have made a walk animation, and I have just begun to get experience with animating thanks to Crocotile, I feel like this went pretty quickly, and I probably could go quicker now that I understand the process better. I could spend more time texturing the character, adding more detail, and refining things further, but I'll leave that to you. I hope this video will help everyone develop an understanding on how you can make fully animated characters in Crocotile 3D. I'm looking forward to seeing what everyone can make. If you have any questions or feedback, leave a comment or join the Crocotile Discord channel. And if you haven't tried Crocotile 3D, you can download the demo today and try all these features out plus more. Thanks for watching.